The burial records for Hawk Ridge, Tennessee showed a pattern that shouldn't exist. Between 1871 and 1881, Granny Elizabeth Crow delivered 43 children. 14 of them never took a second breath. At least that's what the record said. Ada Poot felt the contractions begin just after sunset on a November evening in 1881. Her husband Thomas ran through the darkening woods to get the only midwife their isolated community had known for 3 decades. Elizabeth Crow arrived within the hour, a hunched figure carrying a worn leather bag that smelled of herbs and something else Ada couldn't quite identify. Something metallic and old. The older women in Hawk Ridge spoke of Elizabeth with a respect that bordered on fear. She had delivered every child born in the county since before most of them could remember. Her knowledge of birthing seemed beyond what any doctor who occasionally passed through from Knoxville could do. She knew remedies that eased pain, medicines that stopped bleeding, prayers that supposedly ensured safe delivery. But Ada had heard other things too. Whispers that stopped when Elizabeth entered a room. The way mothers would hold their living children a little tighter when the old midwife's name came up. Martha Keene, who lived 3 hollows over, had lost her baby 2 years earlier under Elizabeth's care. The child had been buried before Martha even woke up from the birthing exhaustion. "Don't worry yourself with idle talk," Thomas had said when Ada voiced her concerns weeks earlier. "Elizabeth's been doing this since before we were born. My own mother trusted her with me, and my brothers." As another wave of pain gripped her body, Ada watched Elizabeth move about the cabin with practiced efficiency. The midwife's hands were twisted, but steady as she prepared her instruments and set water to boil. Her eyes, though, those pale grey eyes, seemed to watch with an intensity that had nothing to do with medical concern. "First baby always takes the longest," Elizabeth said, her voice like dried leaves scraping together. "You'll do fine, girl. I haven't lost a mother yet." The phrasing struck Ada as odd. Not, "I haven't lost a mother or child, just the mother." But then another contraction seized her, and Thomas took her hand, and there was no more time for questions or doubt. Outside, the Tennessee hills grew dark under a moonless sky. Inside the small cabin, lamplight threw shadows across rough wooden walls as Ada labored through the long hours of night. Elizabeth hummed as she worked, an old tune that might have been a lullaby, or might have been something else entirely. Thomas paced near the door, offering encouragement when Ada could hear him over her own cries. The midwife moved between them like a ghost, always present, always watching, her bag of remedies close at hand. When dawn finally broke grey and cold through the single window, Ada was too exhausted to notice. She focused only on the midwife's instructions, on the overwhelming urge to push, on bringing her child safely into the world. What she couldn't see was the way Elizabeth's expression changed as the baby crowned. The way those pale eyes sharpened with something that wasn't quite medical interest. The way her weathered hands reached forward with unmistakable purpose. The cry that pierced the morning air was strong and clear. Ada's son announced his arrival with lungs that worked perfectly. A sound that should have brought nothing but joy. "A boy," Elizabeth declared, but her tone carried none of the warmth such news deserved. Ada collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but desperate to hold her child. She reached out with trembling arms. "Let me see him, please." The midwife had already turned away, the baby wrapped in a cloth Ada had stitched herself during the long months of waiting. Elizabeth moved to the far corner of the cabin, her hunchback blocking Ada's view entirely. The baby's cries continued for perhaps 30 seconds, maybe less, then silence. "What's wrong?" Ada tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. "Why isn't he crying?" Thomas stepped closer, his face pale. "Elizabeth." The midwife remained in the corner for another long moment before finally turning around. Her expression had settled into practiced sympathy, the kind that came too easily to be genuine. The bundle in her arms lay completely still. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said, and those pale eyes met Ada's without flinching. The baby was malformed, born with defects no child could survive. A mercy he went quick before he could suffer. "No!" The word came out as barely a whisper. Ada's arms were still extended, still reaching for the child she'd heard cry. "I heard him. He was breathing. He was alive. Sometimes they make sounds," Elizabeth replied, moving toward the door with the bundle. "Just air leaving the lungs. Not true life. You don't want to see him, dear. Trust me on this. I've seen what the sight of a malformed baby does to a mother's mind. Some things can't be unseen." Thomas moved to block the doorway, his hands shaking. "What kind of malformations?" "The kind that matter," Elizabeth said firmly. The spine wasn't right. The head had an unusual shape. These things happen, especially with first babies. The good Lord takes back what he knows can't thrive in this world. She shifted the bundle in her arms. "I'll handle the burial. Better to do it quickly before the grief settles too deep. I have a place on my property, peaceful and proper." Ada found strength she didn't know she possessed. She struggled to rise from the bed, her voice growing louder. "I want to see my baby. Thomas, don't let her leave. I want to hold him." But Elizabeth was already pushing past Thomas, who seemed frozen between his wife's demands and a lifetime of respect for the midwife's authority. "You're in shock from the birthing," Elizabeth said over her shoulder. "This is the trauma talking. In a few days, you'll understand. I'm doing you a kindness." Thomas hesitated, and Ada's scream finally broke through his paralysis. He grabbed Elizabeth's arm, but the old woman jerked away with surprising strength. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Elizabeth snapped. "I've delivered every child in this county for 30 years. I know what I'm doing. That baby was born wrong." and keeping him here won't change it. The only thing it'll do is haunt this house and poison your wife's mind." She fixed Thomas with a stare that carried decades of authority. "Now you can either let me give your son a Christian burial in a peaceful place, or you can stand here arguing while your wife bleeds herself into a fever. Which is it going to be?" Thomas looked back at Ada, then at the bundle in Elizabeth's arms. The cloth that covered it showed no movement, no sign of the life Ada had heard moments ago. "Do what needs doing," he said quietly, the words seeming to drain something essential from him. Elizabeth nodded once and walked out into the cold November morning. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the cabin. Ada's screams followed her into the woods, but Elizabeth Crow had heard Mother's scream before. She knew they always stopped eventually. They always did. By the time she disappeared beyond the tree line, the bundle in her arms had begun to move again, tiny fists pushing against the cloth. But there was no one left to see it. No one except Elizabeth, whose lips curved into something that might have been satisfaction as she quickened her pace toward home. 5 days passed before Ada could stand without Thomas's help. 5 days of fever and grief that blurred together into a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her breasts ached with milk meant for a child who would never nurse. Her arms felt empty in a way that hollowed out her chest. Thomas had tried to comfort her with the reassurances people offered in such circumstances. God's will. Better this way. At least she was young enough to try again. Each empty phrase landed like a stone, heavy and cold. But something bothered Ada that went deeper than grief. She couldn't stop hearing that cry. Strong, healthy, and maybe surprised at being thrust into the cold world. That wasn't the sound of a malformed baby drawing his last breath. That was life demanding to be acknowledged. On the 6th day, Martha Keem came to visit, bringing a pot of venison stew and bread still warm from her oven. The two women sat in silence for a long while before Martha finally spoke. "I know what you're feeling," she said quietly. 2 years ago, I lost my daughter the same way." Ada looked up, recognizing something in Martha's eyes that matched her own turmoil. "Elizabeth told you the baby was malformed," and Martha nodded slowly. "She said the lungs hadn't developed right, that she'd been born blue and still." "But Ada," I heard her cry too. Just for a moment, but I heard it clear as anything. The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Ada's hands began to tremble. "What did you do?" "I asked to see her." "Begged, actually." Screamed myself hoarse. Martha's voice dropped even lower. "My husband held me down while Elizabeth left with the body. Said I was hysterical, that the birthing had confused my mind. By the time I could walk again, Elizabeth had already buried her in that private cemetery of hers. You never saw the grave. She wouldn't allow it. Said it would set back my healing." Martha's jaw tightened. "But I asked around after when the grief wasn't so fresh. My daughter was the 3rd baby declared stillborn that year. The 3rd Ada in a county this small. Over the following weeks, as Ada regained her strength, she began talking to other women. The conversations happened in whispers during chance meetings at the general store or after church services. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Rebecca Tate had lost twin boys 3 years prior, both supposedly born too early to survive. Sarah Vaughan's first child, a girl, had died under Elizabeth's care in 1879. Heart defect, the midwife had claimed. Elizabeth Moss had lost a son just 8 months ago. Elizabeth said his spine had been twisted, incompatible with life. Every story followed the same pattern. Quick removal of the baby. Immediate burial in Elizabeth's private cemetery. No viewing permitted. Firm insistence that seeing the body would traumatize the mother beyond recovery. My grandmother delivered babies for 40 years before Elizabeth. Old Mrs. Fletcher said when Ada worked up the courage to visit her. She saw every manner of complication and tragedy. But she never had 14 babies die in 10 years. That's not natural, child. That's not right. Ada learned other details that disturbed her. Elizabeth always worked alone, refusing any assistance even when complications arose. She insisted on complete privacy during the final stages of labor, sending husbands and family members out of the room at critical moments. And she had 3 daughters of her own, all grown women living together on Upper Ridge in a house nobody ever visited. Those daughters never married, Mrs. Fletcher added, her wrinkled face grave. Never had children of their own, though all 3 are of healthy age. Some say they're barren. Cursed, my own mother used to call them, though I never put stock in such talk. But Ada was beginning to put stock in things she'd previously dismissed. She thought about that strong cry she'd heard. She thought about the way Elizabeth had turned away so quickly, blocking her view. She thought about 14 babies buried in a private cemetery where grieving mothers were forbidden to visit their own children's graves. Most of all, she thought about 3 barren women living in isolation on Upper Ridge. On a cold December morning, Ada made a decision. Thomas had gone to town for supplies, leaving her alone in the cabin. She wrapped herself in a heavy cloak, took a shovel from the shed, and began walking toward Elizabeth Crow's property. If her son was truly dead and buried, she would see his grave with her own eyes. She would speak words over him that a mother should be allowed to speak, and if she found something else, something that confirmed the suspicion growing like poison in her mind, then God help Elizabeth Crow, because Ada Puit would not. Ada waited 3 more days for the right conditions. When the storm rolled in from the west on a Thursday evening, bringing sheets of rain and thunder that shook the cabin walls, she knew her opportunity had come. Thomas fell asleep early, exhausted from repairing fence posts in the cold. Ada lay beside him until his breathing deepened into steady rhythm, then slipped from beneath the quilts. She dressed in dark clothing and retrieved the shovel she'd hidden beneath the porch. The walk to Elizabeth's property took nearly an hour through the driving rain. Ada's boots sank into mud with each step, and branches whipped at her face in the wind. But the storm was her ally. It covered the sound of her movement and kept anyone with sense indoors by their fires. Elizabeth's cabin sat dark and silent as Ada approached. The midwife's private cemetery lay behind the dwelling, enclosed by a crooked fence of weathered wood. Ada had never seen it before, had never been invited to visit despite her son being supposedly buried there. She counted 17 small graves marked with simple wooden crosses. Some of the markers had names carved into them. Others showed only dates. The freshest earth lay in the far corner, a mound that hadn't yet settled or sprouted grass. Her son's grave. It had to be. Ada's hand shook as she positioned the shovel. The first thrust into the wet earth felt like a violation, a sin against everything she'd been taught about respecting the dead. But the memory of that healthy cry drove her forward. The shovel bit into soil again and again, rain washing mud from the blade as she worked. The earth came away easily, loose from recent disturbance. Within 20 minutes, Ada had dug nearly 2 feet down. The storm intensified around her, lightning illuminating the cemetery in stark flashes. Thunder masked the sound of her labored breathing. Her shovel struck something solid. Not wood as a coffin should be. Something that shifted and gave way. Ada dropped to her knees in the muddy grave, digging with her hands now, pulling away clumps of wet earth. What emerged made her stomach contract with horror. Burlap. A sack of rough burlap tied at one end with twine. Not a proper burial shroud. Not even a wooden box, just a sack like one might use for grain or potatoes. Ada's fingers fumbled with the knot, finally tearing the fabric instead. The sack fell open, spilling its contents onto the muddy ground. River stones. Smooth round stones collected from the creek bed. At least a dozen of them, providing the weight that would have felt like a small body in Elizabeth's arms. Something that had been placed there to decompose, to provide organic matter if anyone ever investigated. The remains of a possum, already partially decayed. No baby, no son, no child at all. Ada sat back in the grave, rain pouring down her face, mixing with tears she didn't realize she was crying. The stones lay scattered around her, mockeries of the child she'd been grieving. Her son wasn't here, had never been here, which meant he was somewhere else. Alive, the realization hit her with the force of lightning. Elizabeth had lied about everything. The malformations, the quick death, the burial, all of it constructed to hide a darker truth. But why? What did a midwife want with stolen babies? Ada climbed from the grave, leaving the exposed sack and stones behind. She no longer cared about hiding her actions. Let Elizabeth discover the desecration. Let her know that someone had uncovered her deception. The rain continued its assault as Ada stood in the cemetery trying to think through the rage and terror coursing through her. Elizabeth's cabin remained dark. But Ada knew better than to confront the old woman alone, not without proof beyond river stones and instinct, not without knowing where her son actually was. Then she remembered Mrs. Fletcher's words. 3 daughters, all barren, living together on Upper Ridge, a place nobody visited, a house isolated from the rest of the county. She thought about 14 babies declared dead over 10 years, 14 children who might not be dead at all, 14 mothers told to forget, to try again, to accept God's will. Ada turned away from the violated grave and began walking. Not back toward her cabin and the husband who'd let Elizabeth leave with their son. Not toward town and a sheriff who would likely dismiss her claims as grief-induced madness. She walked north toward the path that led to Upper Ridge, toward the house where 3 barren women lived in isolation. Toward whatever terrible truth waited there in the darkness. The storm raged around her, but Ada moved through it like something beyond human endurance. She was a mother who'd been lied to, a mother who'd buried stones instead of her child, and she was going to get her son back, no matter what horrors she had to face to do it. The path to Upper Ridge was barely visible even in daylight. By night in the driving rain it became treacherous. Ada stumbled over exposed roots and loose stones, catching herself against tree trunks that loomed suddenly out of the darkness. The storm that had covered her grave desecration now threatened to defeat her entirely. But she pressed forward, driven by a certainty that burned hotter than any fever. Her son was alive. Every instinct she possessed screamed that truth. Dawn broke grey and reluctant as Ada finally emerged from the forest onto the ridge itself. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and through the mist she could make out a structure that seemed too large for just 3 women. The house sprawled across a clearing, a rambling collection of additions that suggested decades of expansion. The original cabin formed the core, but wings had been added on either side, and what looked like a barn had been converted into additional living space. Curtains covered every window, blocking any view inside. Ada approached cautiously, her boots squelching in mud. The property showed signs of habitation but little care. A vegetable garden lay dormant for winter, its fence posts leaning at odd angles. Firewood sat stacked haphazardly near the door. A chicken coop in the side yard housed birds that barely made noise, as if the place itself demanded silence. What struck Ada most was the smell. Even outside, even with rain washing the air, she detected something wrong. Saw milk, unchanged linens, the accumulated odor of too many bodies in too small a space. It reminded her of a sick room, but multiplied and left to fester. She circled the house slowly, searching for any sign of occupancy or vulnerability. Most of the windows sat too high to peer through easily, and those at ground level revealed nothing through their heavy curtains. But near what appeared to be a newer addition, one curtain had slipped slightly to one side. Ada pressed close to the wall and looked through the gap. The room beyond was dim, lit only by grey morning light filtering through other covered windows. At first she saw nothing unusual, a simple space with wooden floors and plain walls. Then movement caught her eye. A woman crossed through her limited field of vision, tall and gaunt, wearing a faded dress that might once have been blue. Her hair hung loose and unkempt down her back. She carried something wrapped in cloth, cradling it with exaggerated care. The woman's lips moved as if speaking, though Ada couldn't hear the words. Then Ada saw what made her heart stop. Along the far wall, barely visible in the shadowed room, small figures sat in a row. Children, she realized. Multiple children, all wearing pale clothing that looked like nightshirts or burial shrouds. They sat absolutely still, unnaturally quiet, not playing, not fidgeting, just sitting with a rigid posture that spoke of discipline enforced through fear. One of them couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Others looked older, perhaps 6 or 7. Ada counted 5 before the angle of her view cut off the rest of the line. 5 children in a house belonging to 3 barren women. The woman with the bundle moved out of sight, and Ada pressed closer to the window, desperate to see more. Her boots scraped against the foundation, a small sound that shouldn't have carried far. Inside, every small head turned toward the window in perfect unison. Ada jerked back, her pulse hammering. She'd been seen, or at least they'd heard something. She waited, pressed against the wall, expecting shouts or confrontation. Instead, silence. The same oppressive quiet that seemed to blanket the entire property. After several long moments, Ada moved to the front of the house. She couldn't retreat now. Not when she was this close. Not when her son might be inside, dressed in white like the others, trained into that terrible stillness. She climbed the 3 steps to the porch and raised her fist to knock. Before her knuckles could connect with wood, the door opened. A woman stood in the threshold, older than Ada by perhaps 15 years. Her face held the kind of exhaustion that went beyond sleepless nights, settling into bone and spirit. Her eyes were Elizabeth's eyes, that same pale grey, but filled with something the old midwife never showed. Fear. You shouldn't be here, the woman whispered, glancing over her shoulder into the darkened house. Please, you need to leave. My son. Ada said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. Elizabeth took my son 6 weeks ago. She told me he was dead. But I know better now. I know he's here. The woman's face crumpled, and for a moment Ada thought she might cry. Instead, she opened the door slightly wider, revealing more of the interior. The smell of sour milk grew stronger. I'm Constance, she said. And you're right. Your son is here. But if you come inside, if you see what's in this house, there's no going back. Mother will know. She always knows. From somewhere deeper in the building came a sound that confirmed everything. A baby's cry, quickly muffled but unmistakable. Ada stepped forward. I'm already past the point of going back. Constance's shoulders sagged in defeat, or perhaps relief. She moved aside, letting Ada enter the house where Elizabeth Crow's daughters kept their terrible secret. The interior of the house was darker than it should have been, even with dawn breaking outside. Every window remained covered, trapping stale air and shadows. Ada's eyes adjusted slowly as Constance led her down a narrow hallway lined with closed doors. Where are your sisters? Ada asked, keeping her voice low. Patience is with the little ones. Mercy's preparing breakfast. Constance walked with her shoulders hunched, as though expecting a blow. They don't know you're here yet. When they find out, they'll panic. We're not supposed to have visitors ever. The hallway opened into what had once been a parlor but now served some other purpose. Wooden chairs lined the walls, small enough for children. A shelf held tin cups, all identical. The floor showed signs of scrubbing, but the smell persisted. Too many bodies, too little ventilation, too many years of secrets. Constance paused at a door that led to the addition Ada had glimpsed from outside. Her hand trembled on the knob. They won't speak to you. Mother trained them not to make sound. It took years to break them properly, but she managed. The casual horror of those words made Ada's stomach turn. Break them. She called it teaching, Constance said. Said children need discipline, especially stolen ones who might cry out for their real mothers. Constance's voice had gone flat, as if reciting facts divorced from emotion. The first year is always hardest. Babies can't understand why crying brings punishment instead of comfort. But they learn. Eventually they all learn. She opened the door. The room beyond was larger than Ada expected, clearly created by knocking down walls between spaces. Morning light filtered weakly through one almost uncurtained window, illuminating a scene that would haunt Ada for the rest of her life. 15 children sat arranged by size along benches. The smallest were infants propped between older children who held them upright. The oldest appeared to be 7 or 8. All wore identical white gowns that resembled burial shrouds more than proper clothing. Their hair had been cut short, boys and girls alike, making it difficult to distinguish between them. But what struck Ada most forcefully was their absolute silence. No fidgeting, no whispering, no normal childhood restlessness. They sat with rigid spines and downcast eyes, hands folded in their laps. When Ada entered, not one of them looked up. A woman Ada assumed was Patience moved among them, adjusting a collar here, smoothing hair there. She froze when she saw Ada, her mouth opening in silent shock. It's too late, Constance said before her sister could speak. She knows. She dug up the grave. Patience clutched at her apron, her face draining of color. Mother will be furious. She'll blame us. She always blames us when things go wrong. Where is my son? Ada's voice cut through their fear. She stepped further into the room, scanning the small faces. 6 weeks old. Where is he? Constance moved to a cradle in the corner, partially hidden by shadow. Inside, swaddled tightly in white cloth, lay an infant. His eyes were open but unfocused, and he made no sound despite being awake. "We give them herbs," Constance explained as Ada rushed forward. "Mother's recipes. They keep the babies quiet, make them sleep most of the time. Easier than trying to silence a newborn through other means." Ada lifted her son from the cradle, unwrapping the tight swaddling. He was thinner than when she'd last held him, his skin pale, but alive, breathing. Real. She pressed him to her chest, and for the first time since entering the room, emotion cracked through Constance's facade. "They're all real," she whispered. "All the babies Mother said were born dead or malformed. She brought them here, told us God had finally answered our prayers for children, that we deserved them more than the mothers in town who would have wasted his gifts." Ada looked at the silent children again, understanding settling like lead in her stomach. "How long has this been happening?" "The first one came 11 years ago," Patience said. She had started to weep, tears streaming silently down her face. "Thomas Vaughan's daughter. She's the oldest one here now. She doesn't even remember her real name anymore. We call her Grace. They work the farm." Constance continued. "Tend the chickens, help with washing and cooking. The older ones teach the younger ones. Mother says we're giving them purpose, a proper family, that their birth mothers would have ruined them with coddling and weakness." A door slammed somewhere in the house. All 3 women froze. The children somehow sat even more rigidly still. Heavy footsteps approached down the hallway. Not the gait of Constance or Patience, but something slower, more deliberate. The measured walk of someone who'd never doubted their authority. "That's Mother," Constance breathed. "She wasn't supposed to be here until tomorrow." The footsteps stopped outside the door. In the terrible silence that followed, Ada clutched her son tighter and understood that the true horror was only just beginning. The door opened, revealing Elizabeth Crowe framed in the threshold. The old midwife's pale eyes swept across the scene, taking in Ada, the unwrapped baby, her daughter's guilty faces. When she spoke, her voice carried no surprise, only cold calculation. "Well," Elizabeth said, "I suppose we need to have a conversation about choices." Elizabeth stepped fully into the room, and Ada noticed for the first time how the children reacted to the old woman's presence. Their already rigid postures somehow stiffened further, their breathing becoming shallower. Pure instinctive fear. "You desecrated a grave," Elizabeth said conversationally, as if discussing weather. "Found my river stones, I expect. Clever girl." "Most mothers accept what they're told." Ada backed away, her son pressed protectively against her chest. "These children don't belong to you, don't they?" Elizabeth's gaze swept across the silent row of white-clad figures. Their mothers gave them up easily enough. A few tears, some wailing, then they moved on, had other babies. Forgot these ones ever existed. "You told them their children were dead." "I told them what they needed to hear." Elizabeth moved closer, and Ada retreated until her back hit the wall. "Look at my daughters, Mrs. Poot. 3 good women, faithful and hardworking, denied the blessing of motherhood through no fault of their own. Meanwhile, careless girls in town spread their legs and produced baby after baby without thought or gratitude." The Constance made a small sound of protest, but Elizabeth silenced her with a glance. "I simply corrected an imbalance," the old woman continued. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but sometimes he needs mortal hands to execute his justice. These children have purpose here. They're fed, clothed, taught discipline. They work, they pray, they serve. What would they have had in town? Poverty, neglect, mothers too young or too foolish to raise them properly." Ada looked at the children again. Really looked at them. At the oldest girl who'd forgotten her real name. At a boy of perhaps 5 whose hands bore calusas from farm work. At an infant no older than her own son, drugged into compliance. "You're insane," Ada whispered. "I'm practical." Elizabeth smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "And I'm offering you a choice, Mrs. Pooh. You can leave now with your son. Keep your mouth shut, and I'll let you visit occasionally. Bring him little gifts. See him grow. My daughters won't harm him. I promise you that. They're gentle souls if overburdened." Or Ada's arms tightened around her baby. "Or you can fight me." Elizabeth's voice hardened. "Try to expose what you found here, and I'll make certain you never see the boy again." Elizabeth's voice hardened. "I've been the only midwife in this county for 30 years. Every family owes me for safe deliveries, for mothers and babies who lived when they might have died. Who do you think the sheriff will believe? A respected healer or a grief-mad woman who violated a grave and is now making wild accusations?" The horrible truth was that Elizabeth was right. Ada had no proof beyond what was in this room, and the children had been trained not to speak. Constance and Patience were too frightened of their mother to testify against her. Thomas himself had let Elizabeth take their son, trusting her judgment over his wife's instincts. "The boy stays here," Elizabeth said firmly. "That's not negotiable. But you can be part of his life in secret if you cooperate, or you can lose him entirely. Choose." Ada's mind raced. She couldn't overpower Elizabeth physically, not while holding an infant. She couldn't run, not with the old woman blocking the door and miles of forest between here and help. And she couldn't leave without her son. Not after everything. From the corner of her eye, she saw Patience wiping tears from her face, saw Constance's hands trembling. These women weren't evil, she realized. They were broken, twisted by years under their mother's domination into something unrecognizable. How many? Ada asked quietly. How many children have you stolen over the years? 14 that survived. Elizabeth replied without shame. One is buried properly, born with genuine defects. The rest are here, being raised as my daughter's children, as they should have been from the beginning. Adair noticed something then. The oldest girl, the one called Grace, had turned her head slightly, not enough to draw Elizabeth's attention, but enough that Ada could see her eyes. And in those eyes, beneath layers of fear and conditioning, something else flickered. Recognition, understanding, hope. These children hadn't forgotten everything. They'd just learned to hide it. I need time to think, Ada said, forcing her voice to remain steady. This is too much to decide right now. Elizabeth studied her, those pale eyes calculating. You have until sunset. After that, I'll assume you've chosen poorly, and the boy disappears where you'll never find him. We have arrangements, my daughters and I, places we can send children when they become problematic. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Don't try to run, Mrs. Poot. The path down is treacherous, and accidents happen in these hills, especially to mothers carrying infants. The door closed behind her, leaving Ada alone with Constance, Patience, and 15 stolen children. In the terrible silence that followed, Ada made a decision. She would not negotiate with this monster. She would not abandon these children to continue suffering. But she would need help, and she would need one of Elizabeth's daughters to finally choose something other than obedience. Ada waited until Elizabeth's footsteps faded into another part of the house before turning to face Constance and Patience. The two sisters stood frozen, their fear so strong it seemed to thicken the air. How long have you known this was wrong? Ada asked quietly, adjusting her grip on her son. Patience looked away, fresh tears streaming. Constance met Ada's eyes and something cracked in her carefully maintained composure. Always, she whispered. From the very first baby mother brought home. But we were so desperate. We'd prayed for years, watched every other woman in the county bear children while we remained empty. When Mother said God had finally answered our prayers, we wanted to believe her. You knew these were stolen children. We'd told ourselves they were better off here. Constance's voice broke. That we could give them what their real mothers couldn't. But the crying, the way they fought at first, calling for mothers we pretended didn't exist. She pressed her hands to her face. We had to break them to keep them. Mother said it was necessary. That discipline was love. Ada glanced at the children, still sitting in their terrible silence. How does she control you? You're grown women. You could have stopped this years ago. You don't understand. Patience finally spoke, her voice barely audible. Mother has controlled us since we were children ourselves. When we couldn't conceive, she told us it was punishment for being weak, for being failures as women. She said if we followed her guidance, proved ourselves worthy, God would reward us with stolen babies. Constance moved to the window, staring out at nothing. We didn't see it that way at first. But as the years passed, as more children came and we watched them forget their real families, watched their spirits dim, I started to understand what we'd become, what she'd made us. Ada felt her son stir against her chest, making small movements as the herbs in his system began to wear off. Soon he would cry, would make noise, and Elizabeth would return to silence him with more drugs or worse. I'm leaving, Ada said firmly. I'm taking my son and walking out of here, and I'm going straight to the sheriff with everything I've seen. Mother will stop you, Patience said hopelessly. She has ways. She always has ways. Then help me, both of you. Ada stepped closer to the sisters. You said you've always known this was wrong. Prove it. Stand with me against her. Constance shook her head. You don't know what she's capable of. The things she's done over the years to keep this secret. There was a circuit preacher who came through 7 years ago. Asked too many questions about all the stillbirths. They found him at the bottom of a ravine 3 days later. Accidental fall, everyone said. The implications settled over Ada like ice water. Elizabeth wasn't just stealing children. She was capable of far worse to protect her operation. As if summoned by the conversation, the door burst open. Elizabeth stood in the threshold again, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Mercy, the third daughter Ada hadn't yet met. Mercy was younger than her sisters, perhaps 25, and her eyes held the same broken quality, but with something harder underneath. Complete devotion. Time's up, Elizabeth announced. I gave you until sunset, but I've changed my mind. You're too dangerous to let wander around making plans. She pulled something from her apron pocket, a small brown bottle and a cloth. The same tools she'd used countless times to quiet struggling infants. Mercy held her. The youngest daughter moved with surprising speed, grabbing Ada's arms from behind before she could react. Ada struggled, but Mercy's grip was iron strong, strengthened by years of farm work. Don't hurt her, Constance shouted, finally finding her voice. Mother, please. There has to be another way. There is no other way. Elizabeth uncorked the bottle. A sharp chemical smell filled the room. She'll sleep, and when she wakes she'll be somewhere far from here with no memory of how to return. The boy stays. Everything continues as it was. She moved toward Ada with the chloroform-soaked cloth extended. Ada twisted desperately in Mercy's grip, trying to protect her son from both the chemical fumes and his grandmother's reach. Let her go. The command came from Patience, spoken with a strength that surprised everyone. She stood between Elizabeth and Ada, her hands raised. Step aside, Elizabeth ordered. No, Patience's voice trembled but held firm. I can't do this anymore, Mother. I can't watch you destroy another person to maintain this nightmare. You ungrateful wretch. Elizabeth's face contorted with rage. After everything I've given you, after all the children I've provided, children we had no right to. Patience glanced at her sisters. Constance, please. We've gone along with this for too long. We have to stop it now. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Constance moved to stand beside Patience, forming a barrier between Elizabeth and Ada. Mercy, Elizabeth snapped. Bring the woman here. But something shifted in Mercy's grip. Her hold loosened slightly, uncertainty crossing her face for the first time. Mercy, Elizabeth's voice cracked like a whip. The youngest daughter released Ada entirely and stepped back, her eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been the first stirrings of independent thought. Elizabeth stood alone now, facing three daughters who were finally, after years of domination, beginning to resist. The old woman's expression transformed into something truly frightening. Fine, she hissed. I built this without you. I can maintain it the same way. She lunged toward Ada with the chloroform cloth, moving with shocking speed for someone her age. Ada twisted away and the cloth caught only air. But Ada's foot caught on the edge of a bench, and she stumbled backward, clutching her son desperately as she fell. Ada hit the floor hard, rolling instinctively to shield her son from impact. The infant finally found his voice, releasing a wail that shattered the oppressive silence. Around the room, several of the other children flinched at the sound, years of conditioning making them fearful of any noise. Elizabeth descended on Ada with the cloth, but Patience grabbed her mother's arm. The old woman's strength was unnatural, fueled by decades of absolute control now threatened. Constance rushed forward, and together the two sisters managed to drag their mother back from Ada. Ada scrambled to her feet, her son still crying in her arms. She backed toward the door as Elizabeth broke free, whirling on her daughters with eyes full of venom. You're destroying everything, she snarled. Those children need us. They need their real families. Constance said, years of justification finally crumbling. They always did. Elizabeth's hand shot out, striking Constance across the face. Patience caught her sister before she fell. The old woman turned back toward Ada. You're not taking him. She advanced again, moving with predatory focus. Ada backed through the doorway into the hall, then burst through the front door into grey morning light. The rain had stopped, leaving everything slick and treacherous. She ran for the tree line, but exhaustion betrayed her. She'd been awake for over 24 hours, had walked miles through a storm, had dug up a grave. Her legs gave out before she reached the woods. Elizabeth emerged from the house holding a fire poker. Behind her, Patience and Constance appeared in the doorway. Mother, please, Constance begged. But Elizabeth was beyond reason. She closed the distance, the poker swinging down. Ada twisted away, the iron weapon missing by inches. She fell in the mud, desperately keeping her son elevated. Elizabeth stood over her, poker raised. He stays here? No. The word came from Patience, who held a piece of firewood in both hands. It's over, Mother. All of it is over. Constance stepped out to stand beside her sister. Then Mercy appeared, joining the line of daughters, finally united against their mother. Elizabeth looked at her three daughters, at Ada struggling to stand with her crying son. Her grip on the poker loosened. It fell to the muddy ground. You've ruined everything, she whispered. Ada got to her feet. I'm going to town now. I'm bringing the sheriff back here. This ends today. Elizabeth didn't run. She stood in the yard like a statue as Ada began the long walk down the ridge, as the sun finally broke through clouds. Behind Ada, she heard the daughters beginning to weep. Not silent tears of fear, but loud gasping sobs of grief and relief tangled together. Her son's cries gradually subsided. By the time Ada reached the main road, he was looking up at her with clear, alert eyes. She held him close and kept walking toward truth. Ada reached the main road just as Thomas came racing up on horseback, wild-eyed and frantic. He'd returned home to find their cabin empty and had been searching since first light. Ada. He stared at the bundle in her arms. Our son. She held the baby up. He's alive, Thomas. He's always been alive. The story poured out as they rode toward town. The river stones in the grave. The house on Upper Ridge. 15 stolen children dressed in white. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, Ada's voice had gone hoarse. Sheriff Hawkins listened, his weathered face growing darker with each detail. He called for his deputies and every able-bodied man in town. The group that climbed to Upper Ridge that afternoon numbered 23 men, including fathers of other children Elizabeth had declared stillborn. They found Elizabeth sitting on the porch in a rocking chair waiting. She offered no resistance when placed in irons. Inside, the deputies found Constance, Patience, and Mercy surrounded by 15 children in various states of distress. The reunifications began that evening and continued for days. Some went smoothly. Martha Keene collapsed when she saw her daughter alive, now 2 years old. Others proved more complicated. Children who'd been taken as newborns didn't recognize their birth mothers at all. The youngest children, including Ada's son, adjusted most easily, but the older ones carried scars that wouldn't heal quickly. 3 of the children never spoke again, their voices permanently locked away by years of punishment. The trial of Elizabeth Crowe lasted 3 days in the spring of 1882. The courtroom was packed with families who existed when they shouldn't have. Elizabeth never testified in her own defense until the final moment. I gave those children purpose, she said. But don't pretend this community is innocent. You all knew something was wrong. You all accepted my explanations because it was easier than asking questions. The words carried a terrible truth. How many neighbors had whispered concerns but never acted? Elizabeth was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. She died 18 months later, never showing remorse. Her daughters received lesser sentences as accomplices, victims of their mother's psychological control. None of them ever had children of their own. The house on Upper Ridge was burned to the ground by vote of the county. Ada stood watching it burn with her son in her arms, now 6 months old and healthy. Around her clustered other mothers, other fathers, other children reclaimed from death. When the last timber fell, Ada turned away. She had fought when others had accepted. She had questioned when silence would have been easier. The stolen children of 1881 would never fully recover what was taken from them. But they would live. They would exist as living proof that sometimes maternal instinct is the only force strong enough to tear down evil that everyone else has learned to accept. If this story disturbed you, it should. Share it. Make sure others know what blind trust in authority can enable. Hit that like button if you believe mothers should always trust their instincts. And subscribe to hear more true stories that history tried to bury. Because the only thing more terrifying than what happened is forgetting it.